My son threatened to cut me off if I boarded that plane instead of babysitting. I flew to help my sister after her stroke anyway. But when I landed, I found 41 missed calls and learned my daughter-in-law had abandoned my 2 grandsons on my locked front porch. We spent 3 months saving for these concert tickets. My daughter-in-law Heather snapped through the phone at 4:15 a.m., her voice cutting right through the hum of the Atlanta airport lounge. The least you can do is stay home and watch the boys for 2 nights. I took a slow breath, adjusting my carry-on strap. My older sister Clara had suffered a mild stroke 4 days ago in Chicago. She lived alone, needed immediate support, and I was the only family member who could be there. I had booked an early morning flight to go help her transition home from the hospital. Heather Clara is being discharged today, I said, keeping my tone steady. She can barely walk across her living room right now. I told you 3 days ago I was flying out. Clara has physical therapy, my son Mark interjected, taking the phone from his wife. Mom, this concert is once in a lifetime for us. We barely managed to get these tickets. You're retired. You can visit Aunt Clara next week. His words hit me like a cold splash of water. They weren't asking. They were demanding that my time yield to their entertainment. They didn't see my sister's recovery as an emergency because it didn't fit into their weekend plans. To be fair, I knew I had enabled this. For years, I had made myself available at a moment's notice, dropping my own plans whenever they needed free childcare or last-minute favors. I had taught them that my life was secondary to theirs, and now I was facing the consequences of my own boundaryless history. My ticket is scanned, Mark, I said quietly. I am stepping onto the jet bridge right now. You will need to hire a babysitter. If you walk onto that plane, don't expect us to be here when you get back. Mark threatened, his voice tight with frustration. I didn't answer. I pressed the end button, switched my phone into airplane mode, and handed my boarding pass to the gate agent. My heart was pounding, but my feet kept moving forward. The flight to O'Hare felt endlessly long. I sat by the window staring out at the blanket of clouds, fighting a heavy knot of guilt in my stomach. A part of me wondered if I was being selfish. Was I letting my son down over a disagreement? Was I escalating a family conflict when I should have just tried harder to find a middle ground? When the wheels touched the tarmac in Chicago, I unbuckled my seatbelt and turned off airplane mode. The moment the cellular connection registered, my phone vibrated continuously in my hand, buzzing so hard it almost slipped from my fingers. Notifications flooded the screen. 41 missed calls, 17 text messages from Mark, 8 frantic voicemails from Heather, and 3 missed calls from my neighbor back home, Jim. My stomach dropped. I bypassed my son's messages first and dialed Jim, immediately fearing something had happened to my house. Lydia, thank goodness you picked up, Jim said as soon as he answered. I saw Heather's car pull up to your driveway about an hour ago. She unloaded the boys, set their backpacks on your front porch, and drove off. The kids were sitting on your steps crying because your house was locked. I stood frozen in the middle of the crowded concourse, travelers rushing past me on all sides. What do you mean she left them? She dropped them at your front door and left Lydia, Jim explained, sounding equally appalled. I went over and brought Liam and Toby into my house. They said their parents told them Grandma was inside sleeping and would open the door soon. Heather knew you weren't there, didn't she? She knew. She had dropped 2 boys aged 5 and 7 on a locked porch, assuming the panic would force me to cancel my trip turnaround or find someone else to step in. Jim, thank you, I said, my voice trembling slightly as I leaned against a concourse wall. Please, keep them safe for 1 hour. I will resolve this right now. I hung up and sat down on an airport bench, taking 3 deep breaths. I had to acknowledge my own part in this disaster. Over the last 5 years since my husband passed away, I had used my family as my sole source of purpose. I had over-involved myself in Mark and Heather's household, constantly offering help even when it wasn't requested, creating a dynamic where they felt entitled to my time. I had wanted to be needed so badly that I forgot how to command respect. I called Mark, He answered on the first ring, his tone sharp and accusatory. "Are you satisfied, Mom?" Mark demanded before I could speak. "You left us with no options. We had to leave for the venue, so we dropped the boys at your house. You're their grandmother. You should be there." Mark listened to me very carefully. I said, keeping my voice utterly devoid of anger, replacing it with firm, absolute authority. "Heather abandoned 2 young children on a locked porch. Jim took them in out of kindness, but what your wife did is reckless and dangerous. She thought you were playing games and hiding inside." Mark snapped, though his defensive tone wobbled slightly. "I am in Chicago," I said clearly. "I told you I was boarding a plane. You chose not to listen. Now you have exactly 90 minutes to pick your sons up from Jim's house, or I will personally call Child Protective Services to ensure those boys are safe. The concert is over for you today." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Mark had never heard me speak with such absolute unyielding coldness. "You wouldn't do that to your own family," he whispered. "Try me," I replied and hung up. I retrieved my luggage from baggage claim and caught a taxi directly to Clara's suburban home. When I arrived, Clara was sitting in her living room armchair, looking frail but immensely relieved to see me. "You don't look well, Lydia," Clara said gently as I set down my bag. "Is everything all right back home?" "It's being handled," I said, sitting across from her. I helped her with her morning medication, prepped a simple lunch, and set up her mobility walker. Being there physically helping someone who truly needed assistance grounded me. It reminded me of what real responsibility looked like. Around noon, my phone chimed with a text message from Jim. "Mark just picked up the boys." He looked furious, but the kids are safe now. I closed my eyes and let out a long breath. The immediate crisis was averted, but the core issue remained completely unresolved. Mark and Heather hadn't learned a lesson about respect. They were merely furious that their expensive concert tickets had gone to waste because they had to drive back to retrieve their sons. An hour later, Heather called me directly. I answered, putting the phone on speaker while I folded Clara's laundry. "You ruined our entire weekend," Heather began, her voice shaking with rage. "We lost hundreds of dollars on those tickets and hotel reservations because of your power trip. All you had to do was be a supportive grandmother for 48 hours. "Heather," I said calmly, setting down a folded towel. "You left your children on an empty porch without confirming anyone was home. You put them in danger to prove a point to me. Do you truly believe that is acceptable behavior?" "We knew Jim would see them," she blurted out, exposing her own calculation. "We knew someone would step in. Using your children as leverage to force my compliance is where this ends," I told her firmly. For the next 5 days, I focused entirely on my sister. I cooked her meals, accompanied her to her physical therapy appointments, and helped her organize her home so she could navigate it safely alone. During those 5 days, my son tried multiple tactics to shift the narrative. First came the guilt trips via text pictures of the unused concert tickets, messages about how disappointed the boys were, and accusations that I was choosing my sister over my grandchildren. When guilt didn't work, Mark tried silence, hoping the cold shoulder would make me bend. Years ago, that silence would have terrified me. I used to do anything to keep the peace, often apologizing for things that weren't my fault, just to stop the discomfort of tension. But watching my sister fight to regain her independence gave me perspective. Peace bought through self-erasure isn't peace at all. It's just delayed conflict. I replied to Mark with one straightforward message: "I love you and my grandsons deeply. When I return home, we will sit down and talk like adults. But I will no longer accept being treated as an emergency backup plan for non-emergencies." He didn't reply. On my last evening in Chicago, Clara sat with me on her back porch, holding a warm cup of tea. "You've changed, Lydia." Clara observed, a faint smile on her face. "You used to walk on eggshells around Mark and his wife. I realized I was teaching them how to treat me," I admitted, staring at the garden. I thought being a good mother meant saying yes to everything. All I actually did was teach my son that my dignity was negotiable. It's never too late to rewrite the rules, Clara said softly. The next morning, I hugged my sister goodbye, confident she was stable and supported by her local community, and boarded my flight back home. When I arrived back at my house, the neighborhood was quiet. I walked up my front porch steps, stopping for a moment at the exact spot where my grandsons had been left sitting days prior. A lingering anger flared in my chest, but I pushed it down, replacing it with quiet resolve. I unlocked my front door and walked inside. The house was clean, filled with sunlight, but notably lacking the usual noise of family. Normally, Mark would have dropped by after my trips to return spare keys or check in. But today, there was only silence. I spent the afternoon preparing. I didn't write a dramatic manifesto or prepare a tearful speech. Instead, I established clear, practical boundaries for myself. I decided what I was willing to offer as a grandmother and what lines could never be crossed again. At 6:00 p.m., I sent a group text to both Mark and Heather, "I am home. I would like you both to come over tonight at 7:30 p.m. without the boys so we can discuss how we move forward." Heather replied within minutes, "We're busy." I typed back immediately, "This conversation needs to happen if we are to maintain a healthy relationship. If tonight doesn't work, let me know when you are free this week. But until we speak, I will not be available for babysitting or family visits." 10 minutes passed in complete silence. Then Mark responded, "We will be there at 7:30. Setting boundaries isn't about controlling other people's behavior. It's about defining what you will accept in your own life." For the first time in years, I felt entirely in control of my own space. At precisely 7:30 p.m., a car pulled into my driveway. I opened the door before they reached the porch. Mark walked in first, looking defensive with his arms crossed over his chest. Heather followed closely behind her expression, cold eyes avoiding mine. "We have 30 minutes, Heather said curtly, sitting on the edge of my sofa without removing her coat. "The sitter is watching the boys." I sat across from them in my armchair, keeping my posture relaxed and my demeanor calm. "Thank you for coming," I began quietly. "I invited you here because what happened last Friday cannot ever happen again. You made a choice to put your sister above us," Mark blurted out, his voice rising. "We planned that trip for 3 months, Mom. We work hard. We barely get time away. And you completely dismissed our plans." "Mark," I said softly, looking him directly in the eyes, "your aunt was in the hospital after a stroke. She needed help. That was an emergency. A concert, no matter how long you saved for it, is leisure. You could have gone later in the week," Heather snapped. "Clara wasn't dying." "I am not going to debate the validity of my sister's medical needs with you," I replied firmly. "What I am going to address is the fact that you left my young grandsons unattended on a locked porch to force my hand." Heather flushed, shifting uncomfortably on the couch. "We knew Jim was home. We knew he'd see them." "That was a reckless, irresponsible gamble with your children's safety," I said, my tone unyielding. "And it was done out of spite, because I dared to say no to you." Mark looked down at his hands, unable to maintain eye contact. The anger in his posture was beginning to give way to embarrassment as the gravity of their action was laid out plainly without emotional melodrama. "I have spent years making myself available whenever you asked." I continued addressing both of them. "I did it out of love. But I realize now that I created an environment where you viewed my life, my time, and my home as extensions of your own convenience. We appreciate what you do for the boys, Mom," Mark mumbled, his tone softening slightly. "We just felt like you didn't care about our effort." "I do care about your hard work, Mark," I said gently. "I know how hard you both work, but my support is a gift, not an obligation. Moving forward, things are going to change." I laid out my terms clearly, without anger or apology. First, I will no longer do emergency babysitting unless it is a genuine medical or personal emergency. Any request for childcare must be made at least 4 days in advance, and I reserve the right to say no without receiving guilt trips. Heather opened her mouth to object, but I raised my hand, politely stopping her. Second, I continued, you will return the spare key to my house tonight. You are welcome here as my family, but you will not drop off children belongings or expectations without my explicit consent. You're taking away our key, Heather said, her voice laced with disbelief. We're your family. And family respects each other's boundaries, I replied smoothly. A key is a privilege built on trust. Leaving the boys on my porch broke that trust. I need time to rebuild it. The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Mark looked at his wife, then back at me. He saw no anger in my face, only calm, immovable resolve. He knew there was no room left for negotiation or dramatic guilt trips. The old dynamic was officially over. Slowly, Mark reached into his pocket, unclipped my house key from his keyring, and placed it on the coffee table between us. We shouldn't have left the kids on the porch, Mark admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Heather was furious, and I went along with it because I was mad about the tickets. It was wrong, Mom. I'm sorry. Heather glared at her husband, clearly unhappy with his surrender, but she remained silent. She recognized that any further defiance would only isolate them completely. Thank you, Mark, I said, acknowledging his apology with a simple nod. I accept your apology. I love you both, and I love Liam and Toby. I want us to have a good relationship, but it must be rooted in mutual respect. Can we still bring the boys over for Sunday dinner? Mark asked, hesitantly. If we plan it in advance, absolutely. I smiled faintly. I would love to cook for my family. They stood up to leave. Heather walked out first, still processing her lost leverage, but Mark stopped at the door, turning back to look at me. I'm glad Aunt Clara is doing better, he said quietly. Thank you, son, I replied. Me too. I closed the door behind them, turned the lock, and stood in my quiet foyer. The weight that had been sitting on my chest for days finally lifted completely. A month has passed since that night. The transition hasn't been entirely seamless. There were a few moments where Heather tried to test my boundaries with passive-aggressive texts or subtle guilt trips, but each time I simply stuck to my rules without reacting emotionally. Slowly but surely, the dynamic in our family has begun to heal on a much healthier foundation. Last weekend, Mark called 3 days in advance to ask if I could watch the boys while he and Heather went out for dinner. I checked my calendar, saw I was free, and gladly agreed. When they dropped the boys off, Mark brought me a cup of coffee, and Heather genuinely thanked me before they left. Respect had returned to our interactions because I had enforced it. Looking back on this experience, I've learned an invaluable lesson about motherhood and self-worth. As parents, particularly as we get older, we often confuse self-sacrifice with love. We convince ourselves that saying yes to every demand from our adult children is the only way to keep them close, to feel useful, or to avoid conflict. But genuine love does not require you to diminish yourself or tolerate disrespect. I was not entirely innocent in what happened. I had allowed my desire to be needed to erode my own boundaries over many years. But real justice in a family doesn't come from destroying relationships or seeking cruel revenge. It comes from having the courage to speak the truth, setting firm boundaries, and allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their choices. Today, my home is quiet. My relationship with my son is honest, and my time is truly my own. Saying no at that airport gate was the hardest thing I've done in years, but it was the best gift I ever gave to myself and my family.
Glad you're watching. Stay with me until the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. When I called my son to ask where to send the gift for his new baby, he said, "Mom, we moved 3 months ago. Didn't Vanessa tell you?" Actually, it doesn't matter. While I have you, we need to talk about the lake house. We're thinking it would make more sense for it to be in our names now since you're getting older. I told him I'd think about it. 2 weeks later, I drove to their house unannounced, and what I found in his home office made his wife go completely white when she saw me standing in the doorway. I'm Josephine Alderman. I'm 67 years old, recently retired from 31 years as a forensic accountant with the state attorney's office, and until 8 months ago, I believed my son was a good man who had simply married the wrong woman. I need to be more precise than that, actually, because for most of his life, he was a good man. My son grew up knowing what it meant to work for something. His father, my late husband Gordon, died when our boy was 15, and the two of us figured out the rest together. I worked long hours. He got a part-time job at 16 without me asking him to. When he graduated from Ohio State with a degree in civil engineering, I cried in the parking lot of the stadium for 10 minutes before I could compose myself enough to go find him. So when he called me on a Tuesday morning 3 years ago and said, "Mom, I met someone and I think she might be it," I felt nothing but hope. Her name was Vanessa. She was 31 to his 34, worked in pharmaceutical sales, and had the kind of immediate warmth that makes you feel like you've known someone for years. She hugged me the first time we met, which I appreciated. She complimented my garden, asked about Gordon, and seemed genuinely curious about my work in forensic accounting. "That must be fascinating," she said, "like being a detective, but with numbers." I laughed and told her that was exactly right. That first dinner, she asked about the lake house 3 times. I noticed it then, but said nothing. Once when she saw the framed photo on my bookshelf, a summer shot of my son and me on the dock, the water behind us going orange in the evening light. Once when she asked, almost casually, how long I'd owned it, and whether it had been appraised recently. And once at the end of the night, when she said she'd always dreamed of having a place on the water. My son laughed it off. "She's obsessed with lake houses," he said, squeezing her hand. I smiled and changed the subject. But on the drive home, I turned it over in my mind. Not with suspicion, not yet. Just the quiet, practiced attention of a woman who had spent 3 decades following paper trails and noticing when numbers didn't quite line up. The lake house had been in our family since 1989. Gordon and I bought it the year after we got married, a small cedar-sided cabin on Lake Whitmore in central Ohio, 2 hours from Columbus. We'd spent 22 summers there. My son had learned to swim off that dock. He'd had his 16th birthday party there. When Gordon died, I kept it because I couldn't stand to lose one more thing that connected us to him. Over the following year, I watched my son change the way you watch a plant slowly lean toward a window. Gradual, incremental, easy to rationalize. He stopped calling on Sundays, which had been our standing habit since he moved out at 22. When I mentioned it, he said, Vanessa felt Sunday calls to his mother were a sign that he hadn't fully separated from his family of origin. She'd been reading books about it, he told me, about healthy boundaries in adult relationships. I asked him which books. He couldn't remember the titles. His college friends disappeared from his social media one by one, replaced by Vanessa's network, her coworkers, her college roommates, couples they'd met through her. When I ran into his old friend Terrence at the grocery store and mentioned I hadn't seen him at any of the recent gatherings, Terrence looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately. The expression of someone choosing words carefully. "He's good," Terrence said. "We just don't really hang out anymore. Vanessa and I didn't really click." I bought my groceries and sat in my car for a while. The engagement announcement came through Instagram. A photo of Vanessa's left hand, her nails freshly done. A round-cut diamond catching light on a rooftop somewhere in the city. My son's face barely visible in the background, grinning. I found out with everyone else, at the same time as everyone else, through a phone screen. I called him immediately. "Mom, I'm sorry, I was going to call you this morning, I swear." We got caught up celebrating, and then her parents wanted to video chat, and it just got late. His voice was warm, familiar, the same voice I'd heard every day of his life. And it made the absence of that call hurt worse somehow. Not better. "Congratulations, sweetheart," I said. "I'm so happy for you." And I was. I am. That's the part that's hard to explain to people who haven't lived through something like this. I was genuinely happy he'd found someone. The worry and the happiness existed at the same time, and I learned not to let one cancel out the other. The engagement party was 3 weeks later. I was not invited. My son called the night before to explain that Vanessa's family had very specific ideas about these things, that her mother had planned the event for their side, and that they'd do something separate for his family soon. It's just easier this way, he said. You understand. I understood that this was the second gathering connected to my son's future that I'd been excluded from. I understood that each time Vanessa's preferences were cited as the reason. I understood that my son, who had once called me every Sunday without fail, was now using language like your family and our side in a way that placed me neatly in a separate category from his real life. Of course, I said. Enjoy every minute of it. We never did the separate family celebration. I kept showing up. Monthly dinners that sometimes happened and sometimes didn't, depending on whether Vanessa had plans. Birthday calls that went to voicemail more often than not. A Christmas Eve where I sat at their table for 3 hours and watched my son defer to Vanessa on every small decision. What to drink, when to open gifts, how long I should stay. Driving home that Christmas, I thought about a case I'd worked 15 years into my career. A woman in her 70s whose son-in-law had systematically positioned himself between her and her daughter, controlling the communication, reframing every attempt at closeness as interference, until the daughter genuinely believed her mother was the source of tension rather than the remedy for it. By the time anyone noticed, assets had been transferred, accounts had been drained, and the daughter had signed paperwork she'd never fully read. I didn't want to believe the parallel. But I had been a forensic accountant for 31 years, and I knew what a pattern looked like. 7 months before the wedding, my son called with a request. Vanessa thought it would be a good idea to put the lake house in both their names as a joint asset for estate planning purposes. He said this in the careful, slightly rehearsed tone of someone repeating language they'd been given. He said Vanessa had a friend who was an estate attorney and had explained that keeping property in a single elderly person's name created unnecessary legal complications. I was 66 years old. I had spent my career reading documents designed to obscure financial transfers, and my son had just called me an elderly person with unnecessary complications. Let me look into it, I said. Of course, he said. Take your time. I did not take my time. That afternoon, I called Deb Frick, a private investigator I'd worked with on 3 separate cases during my career at the AG's office. A quiet woman in her late 50s who had the particular skill of finding things that had been carefully hidden. I told her what I was looking for. She told me it would take some time. I told her I had the feeling we were working against a clock. 4 weeks later, she called and asked if we could meet in person. We met at a coffee shop near my old office. Deb set a folder on the table between us, the same way she always had when she was about to tell me something I didn't want to hear. Vanessa's background checks out on the surface, she said. Pharmaceutical sales, good income, clean credit. But I started pulling her history because something felt off, and I found 2 prior engagements. I felt the bottom drop out of the conversation. First one was 4 years ago. Man named Chester Odom in Pittsburgh. His family owned a chain of regional hardware stores. The engagement ended when his sister hired someone to look into Vanessa's finances and found she'd already been added to 2 of Chester's bank accounts. Second one was 18 months ago. A man named Bo Whitaker in Cincinnati. His grandmother had recently passed and left him a significant real estate portfolio. That engagement ended when Bo discovered Vanessa had been consulting with a separate attorney about asset transfer without his knowledge. I sat with that for a moment. So she has a history of targeting men with family property. That's the consistent thread, Deb said. She researches the asset, isolates the target from anyone who might notice, and then pursues a legal claim through the relationship. She's careful. She never technically breaks any laws during the pursuit. The engagement ends before she gets what she's after, but each time she gets further along before it falls apart. My son has a lake house, I said. Your son has a lake house that's been appraised 3 times in the last 18 months, based on county records. All 3 appraisals were requested by a Vanessa Peel. I stared at the table. Vanessa had been researching the value of our family's lake house before my son had ever called me to say he'd met someone. I asked Deb to keep digging. Specifically, I asked her to look at how my son and Vanessa had actually met. He'd always described it as a chance encounter at a conference. He'd been presenting a project. She'd been attending as a vendor. They'd talked over bad coffee and terrible sandwiches and exchanged numbers on a napkin. 2 days later, Deb sent me a screenshot. It was from a professional networking forum, posted 11 months before that conference. Vanessa had posted in a thread about civil engineering conferences in the Midwest, asking which ones were worth attending for someone looking to expand their professional network. My son had replied, mentioning his firm's upcoming presentation. She had planned it. She had found my son the way a contractor finds a job, by identifying the opportunity and showing up exactly where she needed to be. I went home and I did not sleep. I sat at Gordon's old desk in the study, the one I'd kept exactly where he left it, because some things you just don't move. And I thought about how to handle what I knew. The same question I'd faced in every difficult case of my career. You can have all the evidence in the world, but if you present it wrong to the wrong person at the wrong moment, it disappears. My son had spent 2 years being slowly convinced that I was the problem in his life, that I was too present, too attached, too much. If I walked into his house with a folder full of evidence, he would not thank me. He would call Vanessa. She would have a response ready. And I would become, in his mind, exactly what she had spent 2 years convincing him I was, a controlling, jealous mother who couldn't let go. I needed him to find something himself. The wedding was set for late September, 4 months away. I had watched Vanessa move through the relationship with my son the way water moves through a building, finding every crack, taking up space slowly, reshaping things around her. But water also has one consistent weakness. It can't hide where it's been. I told my son I'd been thinking about his suggestion, about the lake house. I want to do this right, I said. I'd like to use my own attorney, just to make sure everything is handled properly. And I was hoping you could both come to the lake house this weekend, so we can walk through what's there, what would need to be updated. Any maintenance issues a new owner would need to know about. He sounded surprised. Pleased. He said he'd check with Vanessa. They came on a Saturday morning. Vanessa was dressed for a real estate tour, not a family visit. Leather flats, a blazer, a way of moving through the rooms that was just slightly too professional for someone visiting her future mother-in-law's childhood memory. She opened closets. She asked about the water heater. She stood on the back deck for a long time, looking at the dock, and I watched her do the math and her expression. I showed them both everything. The updated kitchen, the furnace that was 2 years old, the septic system documentation. I told them I'd been in contact with my attorney about beginning the transfer process. I also left my laptop open on the desk in the small back bedroom I use as an office when I'm up there for extended stays. I had positioned it carefully. The browser was open to a title search I had run myself on a property in Pittsburgh, Chester Odom's family hardware store building, which had been at the center of a civil dispute involving an attempted fraudulent transfer of title. The case was a matter of public record. The name Vanessa Peel appeared in one paragraph as a party who had been interviewed by investigators. I told them I was going to start the coffee. I was gone for 11 minutes. When I came back to the doorway, Vanessa was standing at my desk. She'd moved the laptop closer to read the screen. My son was behind her, reading over her shoulder. Neither of them heard me. I watched his face change. He read in silence for a long moment. Then he scrolled. I had left the Bo Whitaker case open in a second tab. Another matter of public record. Another name, another terminated engagement. Another property that had come within an inch of changing hands. He looked up and saw me in the doorway. Vanessa started talking immediately. Her voice was controlled, the way a person sounds when they've practiced staying calm. She said the cases had nothing to do with her, that she'd been interviewed as a witness, that someone had clearly been feeding me misinformation because they wanted to interfere with our relationship. She said this with a kind of fluent certainty that told me she'd already prepared for this moment, which told me she'd known it was coming, which told me she knew exactly what was in those files. My son did not say anything for a long time. "Mom," he finally said, "where did you find this?" "I found the first one myself." "The second one was found by someone I hired." "You hired a private investigator." "I'm a forensic accountant who spent 31 years following financial patterns." "This is a financial pattern. I would be failing you if I ignored it." Vanessa said I had violated their privacy. She said I was the reason my son struggled to trust his own judgment. She said every problem in their relationship traced back to my inability to accept that he was an adult who had made his own choices. I let her finish. Then I looked at my son. I'm not asking you to believe me, I said. I'm asking you to make 3 phone calls. Call Chester Odom in Pittsburgh. Call Bo Whitaker in Cincinnati. If what she's told you about those situations is true, they'll confirm it. If it isn't, you'll know that too. I poured the coffee. I put out the cups. We sat at the table by the window that looks out at the water. The 3 of us, and nobody touched their coffee. Vanessa left the room to take a phone call. My son sat across from me and looked like a man trying to decide whether the ground beneath him was solid. She told me about Pittsburgh, he said. She said it was a misunderstanding with a vindictive ex-fiancé's family. And Cincinnati? He was quiet. She never mentioned Cincinnati, he said. They drove back to the city that afternoon. I didn't hear from my son for 6 days, which were the longest 6 days I'd experienced since the week Gordon died. I tended my garden. I called my sister. I slept badly and woke early and reminded myself that I had done the only thing I could do and the rest was not in my hands. On the 7th morning, he called. I talked to Chester Odom, he said without any introduction. His voice was flat in the way voices get when someone has been crying recently and is trying to sound like they haven't been. Okay, I said. His sister gave me Bo Whitaker's number. I talked to him too. I waited. She had herself added to my investment account 4 months ago. I signed something. I thought it was joint filing documentation from our accountant. I didn't read it carefully enough. He stopped. She has access to the account, Mom. Right now she has access to it. He contacted his bank that morning. He contacted an attorney that afternoon. He filed a police report the following week, which led to a broader investigation that eventually connected Vanessa's pattern across 3 states and produced a civil case that Chester Odom's family had been waiting 2 years to bring. Vanessa was not arrested immediately. These things move slowly, and for a while she continued to call my son, alternating between apology and accusation in that particular rhythm that is the hallmark of someone who has never had to reckon with consequences. He stopped answering after the 3rd call. The engagement was formally ended in October, 1 month before the wedding date. My son spent that first weekend at the lake house, and we walked out to the dock on Saturday evening the way we used to when he was a teenager, and we sat with our feet over the water and didn't need to say very much. I kept thinking about what you said the first time you met her, he told me. About patterns. I didn't say anything about patterns when I met her. Not out loud, he said. I laughed. He laughed. The lake went quiet around us. What I didn't tell him then, and told him months later, was that I had been afraid the whole time. Not of Vanessa, not exactly. Afraid that I would be wrong. Afraid that my pattern recognition, which had served me for 3 decades in rooms full of spreadsheets and depositions, would fail me in the one place that mattered most, and I would damage my relationship with my son based on a suspicion that turned out to be nothing. Every day that I waited, while Deb gathered information, while I assembled what I knew into something he could actually see and hold and follow himself, every one of those days I sat with the fear that I was the problem. I wasn't. But I held that fear anyway because it kept me careful. The civil case moved through the courts over the following year. Chester Odom's family was the primary plaintiff. My son provided a statement. Bo Whitaker provided a statement. 3 other men none of us had known about, came forward during the discovery process. Earlier targets, engagements that had dissolved before reaching the asset transfer stage, but that fit the same pattern cleanly enough to constitute evidence. The judgment, when it came, required Vanessa to return funds to 2 of the plaintiffs and pay substantial damages. The access to my son's investment account had not resulted in any actual transfer. He'd caught it in time. But her attempt to fraudulently influence the transfer of the lake house title was addressed in the civil proceedings. I sat in the courthouse for the verdict, next to my son, and I thought about the lake house the whole time. About Gordon building the dock the summer before my son was born, sunburned and cursing cheerfully at a hammer that kept slipping. About the summer I taught my son to identify different cloud formations because we'd had 2 weeks of rain and needed something to do. About the way the water looked at 6 in the morning before anyone else was up, silver and perfectly still. Some things aren't just property. Vanessa had known that. It was why she'd chosen it. My son moved back to Columbus that spring, out of the apartment he and Vanessa had shared, into a smaller place across town. He called on Sundays again. Not every Sunday at first, and then most Sundays, and now I would say reliably. He's been seeing someone new for about 5 months, a woman named Heloise who teaches middle school science and who, the first time I met her, asked about my career with the kind of genuine curiosity that doesn't feel like performance. She has not asked about the lake house. I consider this a good sign. He came up to the lake with me in August, a long weekend, just the two of us. We refinished the deck boards that had needed replacing since the spring. We cooked on the grill every evening. We watched a thunderstorm come in across the water on Friday night and sat on the screened porch eating popcorn while the rain hammered the dock. On the last morning, he made coffee and brought it out to me in the garden, the way Gordon used to do. And he sat on the stone wall and watched me deadhead the coneflowers, and after a while he said, "Mom, I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." "You saw it when you needed to," I said. "That's generous. It's accurate. I clipped a stem that had gone to seed. She was practiced. You weren't the first, and you knew her for 2 years. Give yourself some credit for the phone calls." He was quiet for a moment. "The phone calls were because of you. The phone calls were because you're your father's son," I said. When Gordon didn't understand something, he went and asked the people who knew. He never let pride get in the way of finding the truth. That's you. I don't know if that's entirely true, but it was what he needed to hear, and I have never believed that honesty and kindness are incompatible. I just think you have to know which one to reach for and when. The lake house is still in my name. My actual attorney, a woman I've worked with for 20 years, has reviewed my estate documents and assures me they're in good order. When the time comes, it will pass to my son cleanly, without complication, with every summer we ever spent there attached to it, like rings in old wood. Gordon would have liked that, I think. He always said the best things you could leave someone weren't the things they could sell. I think about the women who came before my son. Chester Odom's family, Bo Whitaker, the 3 others who came forward during the trial. I think about how many of them probably had a mother, or a sister, or a friend who had a feeling and didn't know how to act on it. How many times the pattern completed itself before anyone found the right thread to pull. If you're watching this and something feels off, not dramatic, not movie villain obvious, just a small persistent wrongness, the kind that keeps you up at 3 in the morning even when you can't explain exactly why, I want you to know that feeling is data. It doesn't make you controlling. It doesn't make you jealous. 31 years of forensic accounting taught me that the most important evidence is often the evidence that doesn't quite fit, the number that's slightly too round, the date that's slightly too convenient, the question asked one too many times at a first dinner. Trust that feeling, follow the thread, and if you find what I found, be patient, be precise, and find a way to let the truth speak for itself. That's the only part of this story I'm proud of, if I'm being honest. Not that I was right, that I gave my son the chance to see it for himself. The rest was up to him. Thanks for listening. If this resonated with you, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Have you ever had to protect someone you love from a situation they couldn't yet see clearly? What did you do? Your experience might help someone else find the courage to act. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, trying to figure out what the honest version of it actually is. Not the version where I'm the sharp retired accountant who saw everything coming. The real version, which is messier and harder to say out loud. The real version is that I was scared the whole time. Not of Vanessa, not exactly. I was scared of being wrong. I was scared that 31 years of reading financial patterns had made me see manipulation where there was only a young woman my son loved, and that my suspicion was the thing doing the damage rather than protecting against it. Every morning I woke up during those weeks and sat with that fear before I did anything else. I think that fear was actually useful. It kept me from moving too fast, from confronting instead of revealing, from making myself the story instead of the evidence. What happened to my son wasn't unique. That's the part I keep coming back to. Vanessa didn't invent what she did. She refined it. She learned from somewhere. From watching, from trying, from the 2 engagements that had ended before she reached my son, and she got better at it each time. The men who came forward during the civil case were not foolish men. Chester Odom ran a regional business. Bo Whitaker managed a real estate portfolio. My son has an engineering degree and a careful mind. None of that mattered because the tactics used against them weren't aimed at their intelligence. They were aimed at their trust. There's a difference, and I think it's one worth sitting with. Trust is not a flaw. My son trusted Vanessa because he loved her and she had spent 2 years giving him reasons to. That's not weakness. That is what loving someone looks like when you're doing it honestly. The cruelty of what she did was precisely that it used his honesty against him. Used mine against me too, for a while, because I second-guessed my instincts out of love for him, not wanting to be the mother who couldn't let go. What I know now, and what I wish I'd understood more clearly in those long waiting weeks, is that instinct and evidence are not opposites. I had the instinct first. Something felt wrong at that first dinner, watching her ask about property values over lasagna. The evidence came later and confirmed what I'd already sensed. But I had to earn the right to act on it by being patient enough to gather something real, something he could hold, something that didn't require him to take my word for it. That patience cost me. It cost me sleep. It cost me 6 days of silence after I walked away from the lake house not knowing if I'd lost my son or saved him. I would do it the same way again, not because I'm certain it was the only way, but because I know my son. I know that he needed to make the phone calls himself. I know that the truth only landed because he found the thread and pulled it with his own hands. Anything else and it would have been my story, my suspicion, my interference, exactly what Vanessa had spent 2 years priming him to believe. The lake house is still there. We refinished the deck boards in August. Gordon built that dock the summer before our son was born, and someday it will pass to him the way Gordon intended, clean, whole, carrying every summer we ever spent there inside the grain of the wood. Some things are worth protecting quietly, carefully, and for a long time before anyone else even knows they were at risk. I think that's what love looks like when it's being honest with itself.